Not every scream is born from anger. Some screams come from a deeper place, a place where ordinary language no longer has the strength to express what is felt. When Chester Bennington stepped onto the stage, people didn't just hear sound. They recognized something familiar, a feeling that had existed within themselves, but had never been given a name. He screamed, he howled, but it was never performative. There was no posture of an untouchable icon, no pride constructed as a shield. There was only a human being standing under the lights, carrying all of his fractures, without hiding them, without softening them. And in the end, it is the sense of powerlessness that comes from efforts that are never enough. In crawling, it is the state of being trapped inside one's own body, where even breathing becomes difficult. Those lyrics were not written to impress. They were written as a survival reflex, not after the pain had passed, but in the very moment it was still present. And from there, a paradox slowly takes shape. How can a person carrying so much damage become the voice that speaks for an entire generation? This story is not meant to retell the life of a star. It is the journey of a voice that spoke for millions when they didn't know what to say to the world and didn't know what to say to themselves. In this video, each stage of Chester Bennington's life will be traced through a song, because for him, music was never a career. It was the only way to keep surviving. Chester Bennington was born in 1976 in Arizona, but if one looks only at that point on the timeline, it is impossible to understand what truly shaped who he became. Chester's childhood was not built from warm memories, but from prolonged absences, places where safety should have existed, yet only silence remained. His family fell apart when he was still very young. The divorce did not simply split a household in two. It left Chester with an early sense of abandonment. No anchor. No place solid enough to believe that he was protected. Then deeper wounds emerged. Childhood sexual abuse, an experience Chester later admitted completely destroyed the way he saw himself. His body was no longer a refuge. It became something foreign, even frightening. That pain had no language. A child does not know how to name what is happening, does not know whom to tell, and when there is no way out, it turns inward. Depression did not arrive as a sudden shock. It grew up alongside him, slowly, quietly, like a part of everyday life. Shame, self-loathing, and thoughts of self-destruction appeared very early, not as impulsive acts, but as a distorted survival reflex. Crawling was born from that very state. Crawling in my skin is not a carefully crafted artistic image. It is a real sensation, being trapped inside one's own body, where every thought scrapes against the mind, painful and unrelenting. Chester did not write about pain after he had overcome it. He wrote while it was still there, when there were no explanations, when there was no way out. And because of that, those lyrics carry the breath of the present moment, urgent, heavy, and truthful. It is the voice of a child who grew up with wounds that were never given their proper name. As he entered his teenage years, Chester Bennington did not find relief. The pain did not disappear with time. It only changed its shape. No longer a child who could be overlooked, he became a teenager carrying a prolonged sense of worthlessness. The feeling of not being good enough, not clean enough, not deserving of love. Those thoughts clung to him, repeating themselves, without needing a reason. Alcohol appeared first, as a way to numb everything. drugs came later, like a temporary promise that everything might fall silent for a moment. Not to feel joy, not to rebel, simply to avoid feeling too much all at once. This was not a sudden downfall. It was a slow process, step by step, in which self-destruction became the only way to survive one more day. Amid all that chaos, music emerged not as a dream, but as a crack through which he could breathe. When Chester sang, he didn't need to explain. He didn't need to hide. Music allowed him to exist without having to play the role of someone who was okay. Breaking the habit is not a declaration of victory. "I don't know what's worth fighting for" does not ring out like hope, but like the weary question of someone exhausted from having to continue. The song feels like a diary page, not written to inspire, written to cling to a reason to stay alive. However fragile, Chester did not sing about overcoming addiction. He sang about the moment of standing at the boundary, when the thought of stopping everything, becomes frightening, yet deeply tempting. And it is precisely in that raw honesty that his music began to reach others. People who were also trying to keep going, but had never dared to say how tired they truly were. When Chester Bennington joined Linkin Park, it was not the moment of a dream fulfilled. It felt more like a chance intersection between people who shared the same sensation, not knowing what to say to the world, yet being forced to say something in order not to fall apart. Linkin Park's music never tried to present itself as profound. It was raw, direct, at times sounding unpolished. But precisely because of that, it struck a nerve. Hybrid theory did not emerge as an artistic manifesto, but as a psychological record of an entire generation growing up amid pressure, isolation, and disorientation. In One Step Closer, anger seems to live right on the surface, the driving rhythm. A voice stretched tight like a string about to snap. But if you listen more closely, behind that eruption is not aggression, but endurance that has lasted too long. It is the voice of young people constantly pushed to their limits, demanded to be strong, to stay silent, to be okay, while inside, they are cracking a little more each day. Papercut is not about an external enemy. It speaks of something far more dangerous, the voice inside the head, the feeling of being watched by one's own thoughts, of being suffocated by doubts that never stop. Those lines that sound full of frustration are, in truth, a collective confession of a generation daring, for the first time, to admit that their minds are not safe. Success came to Linkin Park with dizzying speed. Albums sold millions of copies. Stages grew larger. Crowds grew thicker. But wounds do not disappear simply because the lights shine brighter. For Chester, standing in front of tens of thousands of people did not make the pain smaller. It only forced him to learn how to hide it better. What made Linkin Park different was not genre or technique. It was unconditional empathy. Those songs did not teach, did not advise, did not promise healing. They simply said, "You are not the only one who feels this way." And for many young people in the early 2000s, that alone was enough to keep going. Chester's personal pain, when placed within Linkin Park's music, no longer remained his alone. It became a shared voice for those who didn't know where to begin, for those who were angry without knowing why, for minds struggling in silence. That global explosion was not born from ambition. It was born from honesty. And it was precisely that which turned Linkin Park into a spiritual refuge for an entire generation. from the very beginning. Fame did not arrive carrying healing. It arrived carrying the responsibility to appear okay. As the stage lights grew brighter, Chester Bennington stepped into roles the world always considered complete. A husband, a father, a pillar. On the outside, it was an image of stability. On the inside, the pressure merely changed shape, from chaos to silence. Family brought meaning, but it also carried an invisible command. Be strong, be the support, be the shield. For Chester, that meant no longer being allowed to be weak the way he once was. The pain did not disappear. It was pushed into spaces without an audience. In a world of expectations, emotions became something that had to be controlled. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inappropriate for the image. People needed him to stand firm, needed him to keep singing, needed him to be a symbol of endurance. And so, layer by layer, feelings were numbed. Numb was born in that context. "I've become so numb" is not a complaint. It is the weary admission of those who have lived too long within molds shaped by others. No sharp pain left, only emptiness. No resistance left, only acceptance. That song is not about rebellion. It is about losing the sense of oneself, about the moment you realize you have learned how to please everyone except yourself. Fame does not make pain disappear. It only makes speaking about it more difficult. Because when you are seen as having everything, every confession sounds like ingratitude. When you stand at the peak, admitting that you are falling becomes something no one wants to hear. Chester began to fall silent in the way adults do. No more outbursts. No more public intensity. Just a numbness spreading slowly, seeping into each day, each role that had to be fulfilled. Numb, therefore, became the song of many people, not just his. People living under the expectations of family, society, and the very image they themselves had created. People who learned to smile at the right time, say the right words, do the right things, at the cost of feeling themselves. The more famous Chester became, the less space he had to be fragile. And within that loneliness disguised as success, the pain did not disappear. It simply learned how to stay silent. After years of having to scream loudly just to be heard, Chester Bennington began learning something far more difficult: speaking about pain without shouting. Not because he was okay, but because he no longer wanted to hide it behind anger. Chester's music gradually slowed down. There were no longer constant eruptions. No longer the need to push emotions to their highest point just to prove they existed. In their place came space, stillness, lines delivered more gently, as if every word had been weighed for a long time before being released. Shadow of the day carries the exhaustion of someone who has gone too far and no longer knows whether there is a way back. No confrontation, no resistance. Only the quiet acceptance that some things cannot be fixed through effort alone. The pain here does not explode. It spreads silently, like a sunset settling over everything. By the time of leave out all the rest, Chester's voice no longer resembles a cry for help. It feels like a message, soft, slow, carefully arranged, as if he were speaking to the world in advance, in case he would no longer be there to explain. Remember, all the sadness and frustration is not self-pity. It is the wish to be remembered fully, not only for moments of weakness, but for the effort he once made to live with kindness toward himself and toward others. At this point, the music no longer turns outward. it turns inward. Chester does not deny his wounds, nor does he try to overcome them with false strength. Instead, he faces them. He accepts that pain is a part of him, not an enemy to be destroyed, but something he must learn to live alongside. That maturity does not make the music less real. It simply makes the truth quieter. And it is precisely in that quiet that these songs reach a different depth in the listener. No longer the immediate resonance of anger, but the sustained listening of those who are also tired, who have also stopped screaming and are trying to learn how to exist with what remains. This is no longer the scream of someone fighting. This is the message of a human being preparing for the possibility of leaving and hoping that when that moment comes, he will be remembered not only for the pain, but for the honesty with which he faced it. There is a kind of silence more frightening than any scream. It is when someone who once spoke endlessly about pain suddenly stops. In his final years, Chester Bennington did not enter a new tragedy. Depression did not arrive unexpectedly. It had been there for a very long time. What changed was only the weight of it and the ability to keep carrying it. He was still working, still showing up, still fulfilling his roles. But inside, the pressure continued to build. The loss of people close to him, old memories that never truly fell asleep, and the familiar sense of guilt. The feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he was still a burden to others. Heavy did not come into being as a metaphor. It was a direct statement. I don't like my mind right now. No layers to hide behind. No poetic imagery. Just a simple, exhausted sentence from someone who had grown painfully accustomed to fighting inside his own head every day. That song does not ask to be saved. It merely describes a state, too heavy to carry, too tired to explain, too familiar to still cause panic. That is where the danger lies. When pain no longer erupts, people are quick to believe that everything is fine. When someone can speak calmly about depression, the world around them often assumes they have it under control. But heavy is not a sign of control. It is a sign of exhaustion. Chester was no longer screaming. He was no longer calling for help in the way people were used to hearing. He spoke more quietly, more clearly, more directly. And because of that, many people did not listen deeply enough. In a world accustomed to loud tragedies, silence can seem harmless. But for those who have lived with depression, silence is often the most dangerous phase. When emotions have been drained, when continuing to exist no longer feels self-evident. I don't like my mind right now. That is not a complaint. It is a warning. Not meant for the crowd, but for those who know what it feels like to wake up every day already burdened by their own thoughts. And as Chester spoke less and less about his pain, the world assumed he was at peace. But sometimes, silence is not a sign of calm. It is a sign that everything has become too heavy to keep saying out loud.